Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some beautiful backgrounds made easy using embossing folders with coordinating stencils from Lisa Horton Crafts. We have the sunflower field embossing folder with the coordinating stencil. Makes it so easy to color the different details of the embossing folder. Then we have the trellis and bird embossing folder with the coordinating stencil. Now I'm going to make two cards from each one of these sets. The first one, I'm going to use the color combination of the month over on the Lisa Horton Crafts Facebook page. This is Straw Hat, Rustic Coral, as well as Loganberry. I really love the combination of these three colors. They're perfect for fall cards, but you could always use them for other things as well. I'm going to start with embossing my cardstock. I'm just using Hammermill Cardstock here. It's my favorite cardstock for doing stenciling and ink blending on, so I typically will do this for backgrounds. Now with both of these folders, I need a piece of index cardstock folded in half in my die cutting machine to make my sandwich just a little bit tighter, and that way I get a little bit more detail in my embossing. I'm going to do two backgrounds with each one of these folders. I'm going to set aside one of each to do my second set of cards with each one of them, but the first two cards are going to be with that color combination of the month. These are really easy folders to create some beautiful backgrounds, and really all you need is a sentiment after that. You could add a few florals, say, if you wanted, but because there's so much detail and texture in these backgrounds, they really don't need a whole lot. Even just this background all on its own without any ink is really quite stunning. And I'm doing white cardstock here because I want to do that ink blending on it, but you could use colored cardstock and then rub ink on it if you wanted to do it without the stencil, or you wanted a bit of a different look. There's many different ways to use embossing folders. You could also tape that cardstock in the embossing folder and ink the background of the embossing folder, so you also get ink on that background. I wanted to have some white space here though, so I opted not to do that. I pulled out my Tacky Mat and I taped my cardstock just on the top left corner and bottom right corner because I want to make sure it doesn't move on my Tacky Mat. I have some painter's tape here that I regularly use for marking the corners of my stencil to make sure that I have everything lined up. For these, because I have that embossed background, I am not lining them up with registration marks in my corners. I'm lining up with the embossed texture of the cardstock. So I'm making sure every time I put a different stencil down that I'm lining it up with that embossed texture. So that's why I didn't do the registration in the top left and the bottom right like I normally do when I'm working on flat cardstock. I'm starting with that straw hat, and yes, the straw hat has a little bit of a pink tone to it. The front of the pad makes it look like it's kind of a creamy yellow color, but it's actually got a bit of a pink tone to it, and it's intended to be that way. It just doesn't reflect well on the label on the front of the pad. Once I have that first layer done, I tape my second layer onto this background. I do the straw hat again, but I end up going over it with the rustic coral. It's just a little bit too light. I wanted this layer to have some of that straw hat, but then have the rustic coral, but it ends up being too close to that background color that you don't see those details. I'm using the 1-inch flat brushes from Lisa Horton Crafts. These are great for doing ink blending as well as using with embossing folders. You can get a really nice light look with them, but you can also get a heavy amount if you press just a little bit harder. Once I'm done that second layer, I layer on my third layer, and I'm once again doing that rustic coral. For this layer, I'm going to do the rustic coral, and then I'm going to go in with that Loganberry just to deepen the color on some of those areas. This folder here has 4 different layers for the stencil set. The other one, the sun or trellis and bird, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it has 6 layers to it. So for doing just this limited color palette, I eliminate a couple of the layers so that we don't have some of the things inked, if you will. This last layer here adds some detail to those flowers. It also adds detail to the leafy viney bits. So I'm doing that in the Loganberry. Most of these are going to be showing up on top of the straw hat ink. The detail bits for the flowers, most of those detail bits are on top of the Loganberry. So we see just a nice amount of that detail part. You could always eliminate this if you don't necessarily want to have those detail bits, but I really do think they enhance the background, and they also pull all of those colors together. This is just such a gorgeous background, and I can see this being done in so many different color palettes and with gorgeous results. When it comes time to doing the second one, I'll show you a combination, or I'll show them side by side so that you can see the difference between the two different color palettes and how they turn up. I'm going to still use these first three colors with those other color palettes. I'm just going to expand it a little bit. So for this second piece, I still use, or second embossed background, I still use 4 stencils. I eliminate 2 of them. I'm going to start with these leaves here, and I'm doing that with that straw hat. You can see right on the pad how that pad has a pink tone to it. It's not contaminated in any way. This is just the way it is. And like I said, it just doesn't show well on the label of the pad. And Lisa has confirmed that this is absolutely correct. It's not the wrong color in the ink pad. So when I'm doing my stenciling with these leaves, I try to make that ink heavier towards the base of the leaf as well as the stem, a little bit lighter towards the tips of the leaves, just to give it a bit of color variation. Once we have that first layer done, I pull it off and line up my second stencil. Now these are matte blending inks, so they have like a chalky finish to them. They are water reactive, but what makes it really nice to do stenciling with them is my stencils just get to run under water to clean them off. You don't need any special cleaner or anything. They come off really, really easily. And I do clean my stencils between the 2 different color palettes to make sure that I'm starting with clean stencils before doing the second one. I don't want to pull in colors that I don't want or contaminate my brushes in any way. That second layer was done with that Rustic coral pad. This one here is being done with the Loganberry, and we're just again adding some of the details to the bird, a few details to the flower, and then some on that branch. On the branch, it's like little thorns on there. I'm going to put the 4th stencil down, and I'm once again going to use that Loganberry, and this again is doing details on the leaves. This also does details on the trellis in the background. Now what you could do is just tape off the trellis bits and only do the leaves if you want. I didn't bother. I left it on or with those trellis bits there, so those are being inked, but you have a few options there. It'd be a little bit tricky to tape that off if you wanted. You could also use a smaller ink blending brush and just avoid those areas. So there's that second background. Now before doing the other backgrounds, I'm going to create some sentiments, and then I'm going to finish those cards. Then I will be doing the next backgrounds. So for my sentiments, I'm using the More Fabulous Fonts stamp and die set. This has a ton of different sentiments in it for several different occasions, and I love the combination of fonts. It makes it really, really easy to find unique sentiments for your cards, and you don't get really bored. Sometimes when you have a sentiment set that has all exactly the same font with it, it kind of gives off the same vibe. So I love the fact that this has just a really great combination of all sorts of different ones. So it works for different occasions as well as creating lots of sentiments. I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that I can stamp it multiple times. I did put some embossing powder tool on my cardstock before stamping it, and I'm using some superfine gold embossing powder to emboss those sentiments. Regular embossing powder would work as well, but when you use superfine, you just get a little bit more of a crisp detail to it. If you have the opportunity, I would recommend doing a sentiment with regular embossing powder and then a sentiment with superfine, just so you can see the detail in it. I know I did a video at one point where I compared the two, but I don't remember what video that was in, so I can't tell you what it was. But you definitely get more crisp detail when you use superfine, but not all embossing powders are available in superfine, so it's not always possible, especially if you're wanting to do your sentiments in a certain color. I let those sentiments cool for, I don't know, 5-10 seconds. It doesn't take long, but you want to make sure that that embossing powder has cooled. Then I'm matching up those sentiments, and I do tape those dies in place with a little bit of Best Ever craft tape just to make sure that they don't move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. Nothing worse than die cutting a stamped image and having that die shift on you while you're doing the die cutting. So I'm doing more sentiments here than I really need for this card. I always love to do extras so that if I change my mind while I'm creating, I have those options available. Any of the ones that I don't use for these cards, I'll just put in a Ziploc bag right with that More Fabulous Font stamp and die set. So next time I go use it, I might already have a sentiment ready to go that will work for the project that I'm creating. For these cards here, I'm taking a piece of Hammermill cardstock and trimming a piece to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm using that Loganberry pad to ink around the edges. This way my mat is going to match that ink color exactly for the front of my card. It also just makes it really easy rather than having to stop and find a cardstock color that is exactly the same shade. By using that ink, I know it's perfectly matched and I don't have to worry about it. My emboss piece was trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches, and I'm doing this on an A2 card base. All of my cards in this video are A2. I tend to prefer A2 and do mostly that size, unless what I'm working with is a larger scale and doesn't really work on that size of base. Now, all I'm doing here is adding a sentiment to this. I don't think it needs any more because that background is just so beautiful all on its own. The last thing I want to do is I want to give just a tiny little bit of texture because the matte blending ink sometimes is a little bit flat because of that chalky finish to it. So for the centers of my flowers, I'm just adding little dots of Stardust Stickles. This isn't iridescent, so the ink color underneath shows through, and I'm not covering it completely. I still want to see that embossed texture, and I still want to see the combination of the ink color with the stickles. It's just going to add some texture as well as sparkle and just kind of elevate that background really, really easily. I'm doing the same thing for my second background. I have an A2 card base. My mat was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches and ink blended with that Loganberry pad. You could change up the ink that you ink blend on there if you want between any of those 3 colors, but I really like the Loganberry. I like the darker color and I think it frames it nicely. Once I glued down the embossed piece that was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, I added one of the sentiments and again stickles in the centers of the florals just for that little bit of shimmer. This one here has some little flying bugs in the background that I also added the stickles to. Now we are ready to do our second background. So we're going to do once again one with the sunflower field embossing folder and stencil set and one with the trellis and bird embossing folder and stencil set. And again, I'm using the first 3 colors as well as some other colors. So for my greens, for my greenery, I'm using some garden sage because the greenery makes sense, it being a green color. I really love this color because it's nice and pale, but you can always ink a little bit more to build that color up if you want different variations of it. And you can see when I do my stenciling, I specifically make some areas lighter, some areas darker. Personally, I just think it's a little bit more interesting when there's some areas that are lighter and darker, but you could certainly do an even color coat if you prefer. You don't necessarily have to if you don't want to. The second one here I'm doing is some rustic coral and doing it all over all of those flowers. And I'm using those same brushes that I was using for the beginning. I really love those brushes with these stencils. You get really good coverage quite easily. And once you've done the first lining up with the stencil set, it makes it really easy to line up the other layers as well. I find the first one is the hardest simply because you have just embossed white cardstock. It's sometimes hard to see the details, especially if you're like me and your eyesight's getting a little bit older. But once you do the first one, it makes it much easier for the next layers. This layer here, I did the Loganberry for the centers of those florals. And then this last layer here is going to be the detail pieces for inside the florals as well as inside the leaves. Now, the only thing I changed on this background from the first one that I did of this is I swapped that straw hat out for the garden sage. So even though I said I was using all 3, I don't necessarily use all 3. I swapped that out just because I thought the greenery would look nice with that green. I like it with the gardens or with the straw hat. I like it with that kind of pinky tan color, but obviously it looks great with the green as well. And I love doing things like this, like just swapping out different colors or one color and just looking at how the whole piece has a completely different vibe just because of some color changes. So when it comes to stencils and embossing folders, you really have a large opportunity for creative finishes between the different inks you use and between the different color palettes you use. Now I'm choosing to do this whole video with the matte blending inks. I often, my default choice is the interference inks, and these would be fabulous in these as well. I chose to do the matte ink blending inks for this because to me, these patterns really have the look of tapestry to them, and with that I thought they just really suited having matte blending inks on them. And again, just adding the stickles in the centers of those florals once they are done just adds a little bit of extra texture, a little bit of extra sparkle, and just takes it to the next level. But I will at some point be playing with these with some interference inks as well, because I think the results would be fabulous. I just opted to stick with matte blending inks for this video because I tend to not choose them as much as the other inks. So I still love the results of them, but I tend to choose things that shimmer or have a different finish. Like I tend to choose distress inks over oxide inks simply because I like the finish result of the distress a little bit better than the oxide. These inks here, the matte blending inks, are very similar to oxide inks in their finish. So for this background here, I did the Albers Ochre for the flowers, and then I pulled in some tree bark for the bird. I did Albers Ochre first for the bird, and then I added some shading with the tree bark because I wanted my bird to be mostly brown, but it's going to have a little bit of that pale yellow color for the tips of the tail and the tips of the wings. For the next layer, I'm using some Rustic coral, and this gives some details to that bird as well as more detail to that flower. The next layer here is the trellis. And for this layer, I'm going to use that tree bark, make that trellis brown in the background. And once we finish this card and I compare the two of them, you'll see how this one has a completely different feel from the other one. But I love the fact that just changing it up again in with colors, it gives you a totally different vibe to it. I love that with cards, with using stamps, stencils, die cuts and stuff like that, how the colors kind of make different results, really. So just like my last card, I'm going to do the greenery on this one, that background here, with that garden sage, turn it from the straw hat kind of pinky color to the green color of greenery. Now, by doing that straw hat one, it almost looked like fall greenery, where it kind of turns to a fall color to it. I always love plants that have unique color tones to them. So I always love when plants have untraditional colors to them. So I really love those first two backgrounds simply because the greenery is a completely non-traditional color. So again, just like the first one, I made the ink a little bit darker towards the base of the leaves as well as my stems, a little bit lighter towards the tips. Now, once again, I did Loganberry for these detail pieces for both the trellis as well as the leaves. And this really kind of gives it the look of, you know, coleus that has the green with that pinky color to it. By adding the Loganberry to it, it kind of has, or it makes the leaves look a little bit like that. And I love the little extra touch that it gives it with those details. You could always take the leaves and do them in a darker green if you wanted them to stay the same tone. That would work as well. So once again, I did Loganberry on my mat for this card, but we have a lot more colors to choose from here. So you could do a different color for the mat if you wanted. Again, we have an A2 card base. That mat was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And our boss piece is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And when I trimmed the emboss piece down, I made sure not to trim anything from the bird on the right-hand side. So I really only trimmed down the top and the bottom and the left-hand side. Last step is to add that sentiment and then the stickles in the center of the flowers for that touches, texture, and sparkle. These cards come together super, super quick and easily. They're really not difficult to do, but the impact is great because we have the texture from the embossing as well as the texture from the different ink colors we're using. So there was that first one there with, or this fourth one with the more colors, the expanded color palette, then our third one with that expanded color palette. And here is the first two that we did with just that color combination of the month. And you can really see how that first one there has really a more of a fall vibe to it because of the limited color palette. The second one really has a completely different look just because of the extra colors that are in there, but they're exactly the same base products. They're the same stencil, they're the same embossing folder. And here is that first one, and again comparing it to that second one where all we did was change the greenery color, but you get a different feel from each one of those cards. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below, so if there's anything that I might not have mentioned, you'll find the answers there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.